Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of Brian Cole. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Brian Jerome Cole was born in 1995 and lived in Woodbridge, Virginia. He resided with his mother and other family members in a 2,500 square foot house on Manor House Court. In 2013, Brian graduated from high school. He worked as a bail bondsman out of an office in Northern Virginia. Brian was described by neighbors as a recluse who was not social, as opposed to those social butterfly recluses who are everywhere these days. He was known for walking his pet Chihuahua in all types of weather. Shorts and Crocs were among his favorite apparel, even when it was cold outside. Brian would wear headphones while remaining quiet and non-confrontational. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On January 6, 2021, at about 1 p.m., an improvised explosive device, or IED, was found in an alley behind the headquarters of the Republican National Committee in Washington, D.C. About 15 minutes later, a second IED was found a few blocks away next to a bench outside the Democratic National Committee headquarters. The police were able to neutralize both devices. Nobody was harmed. These weapons were viable. They could have detonated and caused injury or death. Both devices were pipe bombs and used the same components: a 1-inch by 8-inch pipe with end caps, 14-gauge electrical wire, a 9-volt battery, a white kitchen timer, steel wool, and homemade black powder. The police examined video surveillance from the area and were able to identify a suspect. On January 5, 2021, the day before the pipe bombs were discovered, video captured a person walking in the evening around the area where the bombs were planted. The gender of the person was not known, but later he was identified as a man, so I will refer to him as a man. He was carrying a backpack and wearing a gray sweatshirt, dark pants, dark gloves, a face mask, and Nike Air Max Speed Turf sneakers. The sneakers were black and gray with a yellow Nike logo. The man was first captured on video at 7:34 p.m. at the intersection of First Street and North Carolina Avenue Southeast. The man walked southwest on North Carolina Avenue, turned north on New Jersey Avenue, west on D Street, and then south on South Capitol Street. He stopped on that street, set down his backpack, put on a pair of eyeglasses, looked around, and stood on his toes. He then picked up the backpack and went back the way he came on South Capitol Street. After reaching the corner of D Street, he turned around again and walked to a bench outside the DNC headquarters. He then walked away, went down a few streets, turned around, and retraced his steps back to that bench. At 7:54 p.m., he planted the first pipe bomb. The man walked away and left the area of video coverage at about 8 p.m. At 8:08 p.m., he was captured again, this time walking north on 2nd Street. He turned west on C Street, then took an alley to Rumsey Court. After continuing to walk around for a bit, he placed the second pipe bomb in an alley behind the RNC headquarters. This was at 8:16 p.m. He was last captured on video at 8:18 p.m. As the investigation continued, the FBI performed a height analysis based on the video surveillance and determined the man was approximately 5'7". Thousands of interviews were conducted by the FBI, and they received over 600 tips. There was a reward for information leading to the arrest of the suspect, which eventually reached $500,000. Even with all the work by the FBI and the substantial reward, they were not able to identify the suspect. No new evidence became available, and it appeared as though the bomber would never be caught. 4 years after the incident, through a re-examination of the evidence that had already been collected, the FBI was finally able to identify a suspect, Brian Jerome Cole, Jr. They examined his credit card history and discovered that in 2019 and 2020, he purchased multiple items in Northern Virginia consistent with the components that were used to manufacture the pipe bombs. For example, he purchased 6 1-inch by 8-inch galvanized pipes and 14 end caps at various Home Depot stores, 5 9-volt battery connectors from a computer store called Micro Center, 2 white kitchen-style timers from a Walmart, 14-gauge electrical wire from Home Depot and Lowe's, and steel wool from a Home Depot store. In addition to pipe bomb manufacturing components, Brian purchased items that would facilitate the manufacturing of the pipe bombs. For example, safety glasses, a wire stripping tool, wire nuts, sandpaper, a machinist's file, protective gloves, and disinfecting wipes. After the 2 pipe bombs were placed on January 5, 2021, Brian Cole continued purchasing components used in bomb making, including a kitchen timer, 9-volt batteries, pipes, steel wool, 9-volt battery connectors, and alligator clips. Investigators examined records associated with Brian's cell phone. On January 5, his phone engaged in 7 data session transactions with towers near the RNC and the DNC headquarters. These transactions occurred between 7:39 p.m. and 8:24 p.m. Again, the suspect caught on video planted the bombs in that area between 7:34 p.m. and 8:18 p.m. These 2 ranges of time are pretty close. Brian drove a 2017 Nissan Sentra, which was registered in Virginia. On the evening that the bombs were planted, at about 7:10 p.m., his vehicle was captured by a license plate reader at the South Capitol Street exit on Interstate 395 South. This is less than a half mile from where the suspect was first captured on video at 7:34 p.m. On December 4, 2025, Brian Cole was arrested and charged with transporting an explosive device and attempted malicious destruction by means of explosive materials. He allegedly confessed to the authorities that he was the bomber. At the time I am making this video, Brian is working his way through the criminal justice system. Now moving to my analysis. Brian Cole did not have a criminal record at the time of his arrest. He was not registered to vote, although he was described as a political extremist and anarchist. He told the authorities that he believed that Donald Trump had the 2020 presidential election stolen from him. The myth of the stolen election has been vigorously promoted by Donald Trump. It was the catalyst for the riot that occurred in Washington, D.C. on the same day the bombs were discovered. Given Brian's belief, it is possible that his motive for the bombing was based on Trump's false claims. Maybe that is why Brian planted a bomb at the headquarters of both the DNC and the RNC. His objective was to attack the government as a whole, not one particular party. Consistent with being an anarchist, he wanted the entire government to fail and believed the bombings would facilitate this objective. If this is the case, it creates an uncomfortable situation for Donald Trump and his inner circle. Prior to Brian's arrest, several conspiracy theories were promoted about the identity of the bomber. For instance, a conservative podcaster named Dan Bongino made bold and unsupported claims about the crime. Dan suggested that the bombing was an inside job, the truth about what happened was being concealed through a massive cover-up, and the FBI was intentionally withholding information from the public. Dan said, quote, "I have zero doubt it was a setup. Was it government? I don't know. I'm not going to speculate on who did it. Someone who hated Donald Trump planted those bombs there," unquote. The claim that Dan made is notable not because of what he said. Unfortunately, his claims were not unusual, but because of who he would become. Dan was later hired as the FBI deputy director. So a conspiracy theorist who suggested the FBI was involved in a cover-up is now working in a leadership position for the FBI. Dan and others who promoted the same nonsense now have a lot of explaining to do. His prior statements conflict with his professional role, creating a credibility problem. Brian Cole did not hate Donald Trump. Rather, he was inspired by Trump and believed his false claims. This must be incredibly embarrassing to Trump and his inner circle. The FBI put all this effort into finally exposing an evil conspiracy against Trump, and it turned out to be nothing of the sort. It was actually Trump's deceptive and grandiose behavior that motivated the bomber. The irony of the situation is difficult to deny. One frightening part, in a story that has several, is how Brian Cole almost escaped responsibility for planting the bombs. He used several tactics which made identifying him difficult. For example, wearing a mask, using commonly available materials to build the bombs, and not leaving any DNA or fingerprints on the bombs themselves. Brian also made a number of mistakes. He purchased materials used in the bombs locally and continued buying items after the bombing. He had his cell phone with him while he was planting the bombs, and he drove his own vehicle into the general area of his targets. This is one of those cases where a suspect gave the FBI enough information to catch him, but they were overwhelmed with the quantity of information. The authorities said there were over 3 million lines of data. In a strange twist of fate, the conspiracy theories both contributed to and resolved this case. Brian was motivated by the myth of the stolen election, and the FBI was motivated by the conspiracy theory that the deep state was out to get Trump. This is what motivated the FBI to analyze that massive quantity of data. They were hoping to confirm that the bomber was anti-Trump. It's possible the conspiracy theorists now regret making all those public statements about this case. However, they are probably just going to generate new nonsensical theories to explain this embarrassment. Every conspiracy theory that gets debunked leads to a new conspiracy theory. Now moving to my final thoughts. The case of Brian Cole illustrates how dangerous it is when someone who is grandiose and manipulative is given a tremendous amount of power. I'm not talking about the alleged bomber, Brian Cole. He didn't have any power. Rather, I'm talking about Donald Trump. If Trump had just accepted his defeat, so much suffering could have been avoided. Instead, he lied, and his deception inspired people to commit criminal acts. Some of those crimes were very serious. Instead of accepting that his deception caused suffering, Trump will probably double down, just like he always does. I have to wonder if he's going to pardon Brian like he did the January 6 rioters. When a president pardons people who are willing to go to extremes for him, it sends the message to those people that as long as they are acting on behalf of the president, they can get away with anything. The next pardon is not too far in the future. Despite Trump's affinity for pardons, I doubt that he will pardon Brian. But if he does, more people will realize that Trump will do anything to keep his diehard fans motivated. Those are my thoughts on the case of Brian Cole. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.